One of the most brutal executions to have ever been performed in England was that of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. He was a rebel who would be taken to the Tower Hill for his execution in front of a huge crowd during the reign of James II. But he was executed by a man who has gone down in history for his botching executions, Jack Ketch. Monmouth was the son of King Charles II, and as he was illegitimate, he was not in the line of succession, but he believed that he was the rightful king. But Jack Ketch's actions with his axe almost caused a riot as he struggled to take Monmouth's head from his body. However, he was exhumed at one point with his coffin opened, and there were claims that his head was sewn back on so that a portrait could be painted of him. But there was also another probability that he was dug up again inside the Tower of London's chapel, where he had been laid to rest. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was the son of Charles II and Lucy Walter, and he was a skilled military commander, and he was also a Knight of the Garter. In the eyes of many, he should have been the heir to the throne. But after the death of his father, his uncle James II came onto the throne. James was not the most well-liked because of his Catholic sympathies and beliefs, and Monmouth was a very powerful military leader, and he was very well respected. He went into exile in the Netherlands, but Monmouth would later rise up. He funded a rebellion by selling a lot of his possessions so that ships could be made, and he wanted to take England and the English crown for himself. James II heard of the plot and the invasion, and his royalist forces met Monmouth's rebellion head-on in the Battle of Sedgemoor. It did not take much for Monmouth to be crushed, and he then fled the battlefield, but he was caught hiding in a ditch. Quickly, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against him, sentencing him to death for being a traitor. He was given no trial, and it was stated that James, the Duke of Monmouth, has in a hostile manner invaded the kingdom, and the said Duke of Monmouth be convicted and attainted of high treason, and that he suffer pained of death. He was sent to the Tower of London to wait for his execution, and Monmouth knew that he was ready for his execution, and on the 15th of July 1685 he was informed that his execution was going to take place, so he dressed himself in clean stockings, a fresh shirt and lace scarf, and he also wore a grey suit and a long periwig. He was dressed in his finest clothes, and he was visited by his wife and their children as they said goodbye to him. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was then walked out of the Tower of London on the short stroll north by the guards of the Tower to Tower Hill, where the executioner was waiting for him. There was a large crowd also gathered to see his execution, and there was some fear of sympathy for him, as he was a rather well-liked figure, and the king, well, he was not. But the executioner waiting for him on the scaffold was Jack Ketch, the man who worked in London, taking the heads of many criminals. The scaffold had been covered in mourning cloth, such was his status, and the king's guard also guarded the wooden platform to ensure that he could not be rescued or escape. Ketch, the executioner, is considered one of the worst and most brutal in history, and he had previous in making a mess of executions with an axe. Monmouth told Ketch to do your work well, and he said, "Here are 6 guineas for you. Pray you do your business well. Do not serve me as you did my Lord Russell. I have heard you struck him 3 or 4 times. If you give me 2 strokes, I promise I will not stir." He was talking to the executioner about his former mistakes and botches, and this may have thrown Ketch's composure and made him angry and made him lose his concentration. He also tried to touch the axe that would take his head, and he complained that this instrument was not sharp enough to cut his head off. He was told by Ketch that this would work, but Monmouth then put his head on the block. The first swing of the axe struck Monmouth's neck, but he caught the side of it and missed, and Scott then looked up at the executioner in shock. The second swing took a bigger chunk from Monmouth's neck, and the third completely missed. Ketch screamed, "God damn me, I can do no more. My herd failed me. I cannot do it." The executioner seemed to give up, with Monmouth bleeding, but not dead. And the crowd threatened to kill him if he did not put Monmouth out of his misery and continue. He had to be forced to do this by officials and guards, and he swung his axe a further 3 times onto Monmouth's neck, and this then killed him. But his head was still attached to his body. He then took out a butcher's knife and cut through Monmouth's neck, before it then fell to the floor. He held up Monmouth's head and uttered the words, showing the traitor's head to the crowd, but there were boos, and the crowd rushed to grab the executioner, who was then escorted away by guards. After this, the body of James Scott was taken into the walls of the Tower of London, as was his head. It would not be placed above Tower Bridge, and he was to be buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel. But there was a legend that emerged regarding his remains and body. That is, following his execution, it was realised that no official portrait of Monmouth existed and had been painted, and because of this his body was exhumed and the coffin opened. Royal physicians then allegedly stitched Monmouth's head back onto his body, and then a portrait needed to be painted. His body was sat for a portrait for hours, some time after his death. One of the paintings of him shows him with his eyes closed, almost sleeping. There is a probability and certain possibility that James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was yet again exhumed and dug up. In the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula needed a significant amount of restoration. Victoria was appalled that this was the burial place of 3 queens, and she ordered building work to be done. With this, the floor in particular needed replacing, and close to the high altar there were some very significant remains found. Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII, was discovered, as was her brother George Boleyn, who lost his head on Tower Hill. Also discovered were the remains of other Tudor figures who were executed, but much of the investigation focused around Anne Boleyn and the discovery of her body. But the remains of James Scott, because they were buried closest to the altar, must have also been found. Because of his status, his remains were later reburied by the high altar, and the closest to it as he was the son of the Stuart King Charles II. But his remains would have been analysed by a committee of experts, and then they were placed inside of a new lead casket with an engraving showing who they belonged to. They were later then, around 6 months later, placed back into the ground, and today James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, the man who suffered such a brutal and botched execution, lies at rest inside the Tower of London's chapel. The fact he is closest to the altar indicates his status as one with specific royal blood. But he lies in front of Anne Boleyn and Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector of England, during the reign of Edward VI, who also lost his head. His interment is listed as number 15, meaning he was the final one to be placed inside of his grave of those high-profile people who died on Tower Hill or Tower Green, or within the walls of the tower itself. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, may have had his coffin opened numerous times also, due to the painting legend about him not having his portrait done whilst he was alive. This leads to the probability that in death his remains were tampered with a lot. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.